right. Reverend Rogers, first of all, I want to start by thanking you for taking time out of your very busy schedule to do the interview with me today. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you.
All right. It's August 14th, 2012, and we're with Reverend Jefferson Rogers. And Reverend Rogers, I wonder if we could start, if you wouldn't mind telling me about your early life. I understand you were from a very interesting town called Quincy, Florida.
Yes, it's been a long time. I was born there in 1917. So it's been 5 years plus 90. So I've been around a long time.
Can you tell me, Reverend Rogers, about something about your parents? I understand that your parents were very distinguished people in their own right.
Well, I guess you might say that. My son and I were talking about some of the years and the fact that I was surprised at how close I came to being born in slavery time. I was born in 1917. What was the year? 18. I forget the year.
They say 1863, 1865, either one.
Well, it's very interesting when you think about history from given kinds of angles. I was thinking about the fact that relatively recently we've inherited a black president. And one measures the way one thinks and the way one feels, I guess, differently when he begins to realize how close or how far he is from events that are of great meaning in life. Mm-hmm. My family lives in countries like ours can stun you. And one of the things that gradually dawned on me against the background of what I said just a moment ago, as one measures the unfolding of one's life, it's overwhelmingly interesting to take the measure of your unfolding in the sense of focusing on how your own life was structured mm-hmm. against the ground of what you've come out of. I don't know whether you remember some of the things we talked about when we talked last when you were here. A stunning kind of event that would run through my mind as I compare the Quincy that I grew up in mm-hmm. against the background of how it unfolded as I became aware of growing up and what it was a few years before that. I said to Alain in the course of our conversation that the Quincy that identifies me was so radically different from what it was 60 years before I was born. Being a quiet student of history, it struck me as mildly, a little bit more than mildly, fantastic that I grew up in a place where slavery ended a little less than 70 years before I was born. It may not strike you this way because you're not me.
All right.
But I grew up, I think maybe close to the first black school teacher. Of course, you know a little bit about this. Was my grandmother. And I had no more of an idea of how one would feel as a slave than you would know how you would feel if you were president of China. Especially since either the first or the second black school teacher in Quincy, Florida was my grandmother. And the unfolding of a period of life during that moment was such that it was almost, for me, like viewing something that could not be at all. And especially since I lived, how much do you remember about Quincy? The big building in Quincy, right in the middle of Quincy, was 3 blocks from my house. And less than 2 blocks from my house was what we called in those days the chain gang. And if there's anything that I remember more vividly than almost anything else, you may not have discovered this in your work there, but every day at a given time, I could see the members of the chain gang who lived less than 2 blocks from my house, going out to do the work. And I don't know whether you've ever seen a chain gang, but they wore uniforms that had stripes. And I suppose that one of the most interesting sights that I can recall, I could hear they lived in a given building, you see, and they would leave about 7 o'clock in the morning, and they would come back around 6 o'clock in the evening with those chain gang, those things on. And I could see them from where I live. That kind of scene would stick in your mind. Something maybe I ought not to say, but that is history. Well, it's history. Whether you should print it or not, I don't know. It's the kind of history that sometimes is not routinely told.
Did Reverend Rogers, you mentioned that your grandmother being the first school teacher in Quincy. Did she talk about how difficult it was for her, like in terms of race relations, what she had went through?
Well, I guess she did, but it was just routine. These are things, when you ask questions like that, it's similar to what I didn't tell you just a moment ago. It's something that ought not to be told, because it is history. The father, I'll come back to your question.
Okay.
The father of the woman that we've been talking about, in such glowing terms, in terms of her own history, her father was on the chain gang. Now I'm saying, normally you wouldn't say that.
Mm-hmm.
It ought not to be said, because that's historic background.
Mm-hmm.
You see?
Yes, sir.
And it's of significance in my judgment. Mm-hmm. Even against the question that you asked about my grandmother, that these kinds of data can easily be called valid historical data. Mm-hmm. I don't know that anybody would mention to you what I just said a few moments ago, because the woman we were talking about is a hero there. Mm-hmm. But it would not be unusual for that to be true of anybody who came through Quincy.
Right.
You see?
Yes, sir.
And of course, her sister, as you very well know, is a famous writer, who is a valid name in history. But you were asking me a question about my grandmother. Uh-huh. What was that? How did you phrase it?
Well, I was asking you what kind of difficulties did she face being a black school teacher in terms of race relations, because I know that the white power structure did not like black educators often.
Well, I guess the only way to say it is what is true. She suffered the same kind of life that was true for any town of that kind at the stage of history that she lived in. My own background is, in that regard, is almost the same as the young woman we were talking about. Mm-hmm. My grandmother was married to a black man whose father was a slave owner. I've always been talkative, and I talk to them all the time about it. And I said, Papa, that's what we called him. I said, your father was a slave owner. He said, yeah. I said, how many slaves did you have, Papa? You know what he said? One. The character of my grandfather's relationship to the woman with whom he lived, she was his slave. I said, Papa said, how many slaves did he have? One. He had 8 children. My grandfather had 8 children by one slave. The character of that, going more intimately into it, was the simple fact that it was not simply true of my grandfather. In any number of instances, you couldn't be man and wife as a slave and a slave concubine. So, in matter of fact, my grandfather had one slave who, if you just twist this a little bit, would have been his wife. They had 8 children all. Mm-hmm. 7 lived later on in Chicago, and I only knew one. She would come from Chicago to Quincy to be with the family. But she didn't stay with us. She stayed with somebody else. And that one that I knew was Aunt Julia. So that was the basic ground that I knew about in my own grand family at that point. My grandfather was this is interesting kind of history. He was a carpenter, and his father saw to it that he was taught to be a carpenter. That kind of thing is regular in him anyway, because there were white slave owners who, when the kind of intimacy is similar to my grandfather, they took care of the slaves. And so in the background of the variety of things that you would find in this period, mm-hmm. you would find fathers like my great-grandfather mm-hmm. who would take care of their children and send them to school. And so in that kind of fact, that is the ground out of which I come. Papa became a relatively skilled carpenter. Of course, my grandmother, they were not slaves. They were born just 10 seconds before. they might have been slaves. So that in that sense, you could say that there was some form of privilege in their growing up. Neither of them were slaves. They were the children of people who had been qualified slaves. And so that provided for Papa a good ground on which to live in terms of material things. And so he was taught by whoever would be teaching you to be artisans. And of course, my grandmother had the privilege of being able to go to school and become quasi-learned enough to become one of the first black school teachers in Quincy, Florida. And of course, later on, one of the things that happened during her lifetime, I don't know whether she was the first school teacher, black school teacher, but she was either one or two, and she taught all her life, and she was contemporaneous with a name you heard, Dr. Stevens.
Dr. Stevens.
Dr. Stevens was the doctor when I was born, and I was a cesarean baby. You of course know about this. I guess you use some of that in your book. To be a cesarean baby in 1917, that's a long time back. And of course, I've got some pictures over here someplace I'll show you. He, not only was he the first black doctor in Quincy, Florida, in 1917, and this stunned me. You'll be aware from your book that the black drugstore was Dr. Stevens' drugstore. But what stunned me was that the what do you call the guy who makes the medicine?
The pharmacist.
Well, no. That's not the name they use for it.
Druggist, pharmacist.
Huh? The guy who makes the medicine. What do you call him?
Like Arlene.
Huh?
Like Arlene. What Arlene does.
No, when you go to the drugstore, who makes the medicine in the drugstore?
Well, the pharmacist prescribes.
Pharmacist, yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Now, Dr. Stevens had, he was a black man with a drugstore with a pharmacist. And then, of course, the skills were not obviously as advanced as they are in later years, but the drugstore, the hospital that Dr. Stevens had wasn't a great hospital, but it was a hospital. And taking a baby from inside, that was unusual. And so my grandmother would always tell me that I owed my life to Dr. Stevens. And of course, you talked to her, his daughter, Inez.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. So that was, I think you could call that, even from where I sit, a kind of special setting. As early as 1917. So that's a mini story behind the question that you are asking. Because it did provide a setting that was the foundation not only for my grandparents, my parents. But it was true, again, I go back to your book, of any number of things that were true of Quincy. The togetherness of blacks and Indians were an important aspect of that kind of scene. Indians and African Americans fought against whites in that area. And inasmuch as it is true that there was some kind of leverage, unusually so, for my own family, it was true in some measure for that whole area. Alongside the fact that there were almost, I don't know how close it was, but there were about as many blacks in Quincy as there were white people in Quincy. And of course, during that moment, that general moment, there were battles between American whites and American blacks and Indians, which made for two things. It made for distance, and it made for togetherness. It could probably be said that during that general moment, it could be easily said that there were time spans when African Americans they weren't equal to whites, but they were almost that way. Blacks owned what we call the ice house. There was the pharmacy. They owned the electric plant. They were copacetic with the Indians. There were battles between the Indians and African Americans and white people. So that it could be easily said that in an elongated answer to your questions, there was a kind of unusual leverage for blacks in that area, though I guess they didn't have the kind of family life that my grandfather had, but there was the kind of moment in Quincy, the result of which you can see now. I can remember the time when there were only a handful of blacks who would vote. There was a time when you'd have to ease black papers into Quincy. I wish I had one of my papers here now. The main paper in Gaston County is black paper. The mayor's black. A good more than half of the bigwigs in Quincy are black people. So in answering the question you asked about my family, a good deal of what was true of the leverage that they were fortunate enough to be placed to take advantage of It's 1,000 times more than that. The mayor is black. Almost all of the big wigs are black. They only one newspaper in Quincy now, and that I don't know if a white man owns it or not, because that slips in too.
Yeah. Back in the old days, it was the Democrat was the paper. Is that still the paper now, or is that?
Well, I know more of the writers for the paper.
Yeah.
Are black.
Yeah.
But it's a kind of growth thing.
Yeah.
Because the Quincy paper is a black paper. And the leverage of togetherness could easily be called what you might call normal. And so the story of the prominence that you speak of in the Paramore and Rogers family is true in a measure of the character of the community these days.
That's right. Reverend Rogers, I think one time, now I could be mistaken about this, but one time when we spoke on the phone, you told me that your grandmother's, there was something that happened and her house was burned down.
Oh, yeah. Well, what the black community would call white folk in terms of the battle, that was normal for Quincy. My grandmother, not because of, I wouldn't say, but certainly it was part of it. I think that it would be honest to say that the character of their individual background did provide them with an unusual start. It's simply honest to say that my grandmother was a dominant type woman. Overwhelmingly industrious. And she was the kind of person, if there was one chicken and there were 10 people after it, she would get her share part of it. And she owned places. She owned about, well, I guess at least 7 pieces of property in Quincy with 3 or 4 houses on it. My grandfather was the one skilled black carpenter there, so that it is simply true that they had a head start, and a part of that kind of propriety ended up with, again, my grandmother owning property. And our house was on a hill less than 2 blocks from the center of the town. And during those early days, they used to, I guess they still do it, but they used advertising billboards. It was work like cutting logs and putting the billboards up. Mm-hmm. And part of the industry that was part and parcel of my grandmother, in addition to her owning land, she got a choice spot, despite the fact that it was just two blocks from the chain gang. She built a 2-story almost a three-story house. The top floor of which had about 7 rooms. And she would rent that out to people who would cut the logs and build a billboard. It was an ideal spot. Mm-hmm. And in addition to the fact that she taught school, this other industrious thing that identified her as much as anything else, and the buying of land. She wasn't rich, but she was well put. And the white folk wanted that land and that two-story house. And they burned it down. Because they wanted the land. But something about the total psychology of the city and the special kind of person my grandmother was. She built another house. She didn't build a house like that because she had about easily 7 people who would rent the rooms in the house that was out. Because we had that big house and another one right next to it where the family lived. So the first burning was that house. They were going to scare her away. But she built another house where I was born. And that's the fundamental story. But the interesting thing, the thing about fate, even after I went to college, my cousins were living there, and my nephew started a fire there, and but that was the essence of that story, and I guess that the spiritual significance is that there was that kind of moxie which enabled the kind of attitude that my grandmother had. She was a tough woman to build that second house. Of course, then she had the career as a school teacher too, and so we managed to stay there. One of the oddities about this country and people was that, as odd as that may sound in a given day like this moment, I guess it wouldn't even sound that way, but she, despite all that happened, she was close to white people. A minor thing like what I'm going to say now, she was able to maintain with the white community, if you think in terms of upper class people, she knew all of what in those days we would call good white people. And the character of her fortitude and brazen honesty was such that she could walk into the bank. Of course, $100 wouldn't sound like a whole lot of money to you now. but she could walk in the bank and borrow $100 or $200 on her own signature, just like that. So that she became, in that sense, almost easily the most prominent black woman in town. Of course, I learned something from your book I did not know. The two most significant black folk in this wise was my grandmother and Dr. Stevens. And because of what at least seemed to me the unusual ability for Mama to be as close as she was to white people with the power of the white community, such that could enable them brazenly to just burn a person's house down. And of course, I learned from your book. I did not know that, or maybe it was your book. I think your book carried the story of Dr. Stevens' uncle being killed by white men. I didn't know that. I did not know that at all.
His daughter, Inez, told me that history.
But that kind of climate, I go back to the blacks and the Indians fighting the white folk.
Did people talk about that when you were growing up?
Oh yeah. But there would be fights. In spite of the chain gang, the sociologist talks about the bad nigger. James Weldon Johnson wrote an article that included the view that every town like that needed bad niggers. He was using that in a sociological sense. He wrote a story on bad niggers. And a phrase that he would use, he says, every town needs its bad niggers, because you didn't walk into an area of so-called bad niggers without fear and trembling. Not James Weldon Johnson. What was the writer's name? You know his name, because
not Sutton Griggs, but
one of our most famous writers. Alain?
Not Langston, not Chester Himes.
He wrote a poem. Sterling Brown.
Sterling Brown.
Sterling Brown.
Yes. Okay.
He wrote a poem. They come by chance. He says they don't come by talking about white folk going into the black community. The officers go into the black community, and Sterling Brown would start the poem. He said, they don't come by ones. They don't come by twos. They come by tens.
Right.
And Sterling Brown also wrote an essay, the theme of which was every town needs bad niggers, because they were protection against the lynchers, you see. So when the police would go to Black Town, And when the officer would go to a black town, you wouldn't be dumb enough to be one policeman going into black town. So that was the theme of Sterling Brown's poem.
Yeah.
They don't come by one.
They don't go, yeah.
They come by two, but they come by 10.
By tens, right?
So that was typical of, that's a typical kind of effort to answer the question you're asking me. Because the white folk would do it, and the black folk would fight. Mm-hmm. And it was out of that both the educational unusualness and the battle to stay afloat financially. Again, it's overwhelmingly important. I don't know that you knew this, whether you found out the black folk own the electric plant. They own the ice plant. All of those things, which makes it easily clear that they own everything now. You see. And out of that vortex, that's a wide answer to your question.
Reverend Rogers, your grandmother that you're speaking of, her name was Hattie Paramore?
Hattie Paramore, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure.
Yeah. And then, of course, her original name was Macon. She took, of course, my grandfather's name. Mm-hmm. His was Paramore. And there's a white Paramore family there now.
In Quincy.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And that's the basic story.
Do the two branches have much contact today? Do the two branches of the Paramore family have contact today, or they?
Well, I don't know. I just know we weren't close to them, even though the only person that I knew by name was Aunt Julia. They moved to Chicago, mm-hmm. and the relationship was significant enough for an occasion. There were a couple other, but the only one I knew was Aunt Julia, mm-hmm. and they would come to Quincy to visit Papa, mm-hmm. And he was a funny man, a very religious man, and funny at the same time. And I would always smile at how easily he would get along with his siblings. Because I didn't care very much for Aunt Julia, but I'd see her when she would come down.
Reverend Rogers, if it's okay with you, I wonder if we could kind of almost fast forward to when you ended up going to Howard University School of Religion, because
that's a long story.
You were recruited by Dr. Benjamin Mays. I wonder if you could talk about that relationship.
Well, that's a long story, but it could be said. I remember when I was at Howard University. Do you know the Coca-Cola story about Quincy?
The Coca-Cola story? No, I don't.
There were at least 7. They weren't black. There were at least 7 white men in Quincy who were millionaires because of stock that they managed to get a hold of at the beginning of Coca-Cola.
Oh, I didn't know that.
You know the name Monroe. Pat Monroe was one of the main millionaires.
Oh, I'll be darned.
And there were about 7 families in Quincy. However it happened, who got I never understand. I don't understand it enough. I don't understand how you could do that. I don't understand enough about business to know how stock in an outstanding industry could make you rich like that. But that's a steady story. If you were to go to Quincy tomorrow, you would see the same building. Of course, I think they've done it over again with Coca-Cola sign in there. I grew up watching that sign.
Wow.
But Quincy was famous for that. And again, I keep making the same statement over and over again because I do think that Quincy was a little bit unusual, which is accounted for the fact that it's probably the most prosperous small town in the state of Florida. So that again, I guess it could very well be said that the story that I'm rightfully trying to underscore had as much to do with the general climate as it was responsible for a given kind of specialness. You're a historian. I mean, how could you account for that?
Well, it reminds me of something that Patricia Stevens told us when she spoke, and when Patricia, they lived in Miami, her and John, for many years. And when she told her friends in Miami that her and John were planning to move back to Quincy, the Miami people said, "Oh, you can't move back there. That's a backwards area. That's the Panhandle. And she said, "No." She said, "That's
it's not backwoods."
Yeah, she said it's more progressive than Miami, and she said the Miami people just couldn't seem to understand that.
Well, again, in an effort, partly to answer your last question, it was the unusual kind of spirituality of Quincy. Period. I think that there were several good families there, and ours was one of the better families in that sense. How it happened, I can't rightly say, but we were an avant-garde family. My brother, or half-brother of mine, was making radios in the early 1920s. He was unusually brilliant. He went to school. He died when he was about 20, I think. But we lived half-time in Jacksonville, Florida, because in addition to owning property in Quincy, my grandmother would own property everywhere. Mm-hmm. So I lived the first 11 years of my life. I don't know whether I told you this or not. I lived the first 11 years of my life in Jacksonville because my grandmother had a house there. And just by, I guess, accident, little John, his last name was Paramore. It just happened that he was unusually brilliant. So much so that he was at Stanton High School. He was the top student there. His ableness in terms of he was scientific. John could do everything.
He went to Stanton High School?
Stanton High School, yeah. He was the top student there. And in the days, of course you can't remember this because you way back, I can remember when radios were special.
Right.
And little John was making them in high school. And he was a top athlete. And he wasn't what James Weldon Johnson would call a bad nigger. But he was a dangerous one. He had the odd combination of being almost always the top student, overwhelmingly well-liked, but there was an oddity about him. You didn't bother little John. One of the legendary stories in my history, I told you that we lived on that hill.
Mm-hmm.
You could walk down the hill, you'd know it if you saw it. Mr. George Knowles, I'll never forget his name. Mr. George Knowles, he was a white owner of a store right down the hill from where we lived. Little John wasn't what he looked like. He was tender. Almost everybody liked him. He didn't do the wrong thing with it. Mr. Knowles cursed my grandmother one day, and little John wasn't there. He was a quiet boy. You liked him immensely.
Mm-hmm.
If you knew him well, you wouldn't make a drastic mistake with it. My grandmother was easily, without any competition, she was the most well-liked woman in town. So when little John came home, of course he had to know. You know what he did? We didn't have guns in those days. Mm-hmm. We had, everybody went hunting, with the rifles.
Yeah.
Little John came home, quiet boy. He didn't say anything. In about 20 minutes, he got his shotgun. And he sat on the steps. Mr. Knowles found out that little John was sitting on the steps with a shotgun. Now, it's hard to describe little John. He would have killed him. He just sat on the steps. You know what Mr. Knowles did? He went to his country home and stayed 2 weeks. He didn't come back there. Now, here was a boy who was as kind. I don't know whether you call little John schizophrenic or not, But Mr. Knowles knew what was going to happen. So he stayed away from the store for 2 weeks. That much time. And little John he was an odd boy in that sense. He didn't have to tell us what he was going to do. Everybody knew that. To be as well liked as John was, the people loved him. Mm-hmm. But in a context like this, you were scared of little John. He didn't go around saying, what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
He just sat on that stuff. Of course, it died down. I was scared of little John too, not because he'd do anything to me, but I was scared of what little John would do.
Right.
You see, Quincy was a funny town. It was a real funny town. And the thing that makes it seem like I'm lying, with all of this, the white folk and the black folk got along. There was a funny kind of ingredient. It was an odd kind of respect, mm-hmm. Which goes back to the lady that you talked about just died. Her father's name was Snow. Snow wasn't a little John, but he was one of those kinds of characters that you respected because of the kind of fellow he was. And that general mix mm-hmm. of people like that created what in the final analysis you'd have to call progressive, because they get along well now.
Yeah. Well, it's a kind of world that I think was confusing to sociologists of race who had a very difficult time putting people in categories, but it made more sense to a person like, say, a Howard Thurman.
Yeah.
Howard Thurman understood those contradictions.
Yes, he did.
Right?
He did. In an unusual way.
Right.
I mean, he was my man, of course.
Yeah.
No. The world is interesting. And I grew up around people like that. The intimate environment of my life is responsible for what I tried to do. Not only Howard Thurman in my life, it was the kind of factor that defines one's relationship to the world. Howard Thurman has been overwhelmingly important in my life, but not only Howard Thurman. One man, in one sense, might have been equally important, if not more important. Does the name Benjamin Mays say anything to you?
Mm-hmm.
Benjamin Mays. We used to have a week of prayer at A&M College. In 1939 and 1940, Benjamin Mays was the week of prayer speaker. Mm. I was one of the young men during those days who had been a member of a group that was a theological group. How he got my name, I guess I do know it. My philosophy, my history teacher was a man named Dean Southall. And about the third day of the week, Southall came to me and said, Dr. Mays would like to talk to you. He sent for me. I was not over talkative, but I was not quiet either. Almost all of the students were attracted to Dr. Mays, but he sent for me. Dr. Mays probably was as spiritually influential a man as you ever want to meet in your whole life. And he wanted to interest me in going to seminary. And in the course of the talk, I had occasion to tell him what I thought was the truth. I said, well, you know, I grew up in the church, and I probably have been more than normally attracted. But then I was more than that. I danced well. I did some of everything that a normal boy would do. And he was talking to me about my life, and with the intent of, he was famous for getting people to go to seminary. But it was during one of my great growing moments, and I kind of fallen out with the church because of the American problem of race. I got along overwhelmingly well with almost everybody. And so I told him in the course of our conversation that I made up my mind that there were three things: religion, history, and law school. But I did not like how slow the church was moving, and I thought that my path was going to follow what I thought could best do justice to the American problem of race relations. And then I talked against the church in a good way because of what it was not doing, you know. But Mays was persuasive. He was persuasive not in the pushing way. Mm-hmm. He was a man that you just listened to. But I didn't promise I was going to go. So that summer I graduated. I guess Mays asked me 1,000 questions, and the more I would discourage him, the more relaxed he would get. So the last thing he said, one of the last things he said, I'm going to get a scholarship for you at Howard University. And I told him no, in effect. Mm-hmm. He was the dean of the School of Religion at Howard University. And he was coming to Morehouse that very next year. And he wrote me a letter indicated that he'd prepared for scholarship, and I didn't answer it. He wrote me a second letter. I didn't answer that either. The man wrote me a third letter. I didn't answer that either. He was a man who was the biggest man in that intellectual world. He wrote me 3 letters. And the last letter came. I didn't answer that one either. The next day, my grandma said, Jeff, I got a letter from Dr. Rogers. I packed my bag the next day and took the bus to Atlanta. Dr. Mays had sent a cab for me. He drove me to Morehouse's campus. Dr. Mays put me up in the guest room. I didn't believe any of this, but it happened. He gave me $50, my fare, to Washington, D.C. That's how I got in theology school. I didn't have any money but that $50 he gave me. I got a job in a rooming house that enabled me to pay my bills. The biggest snow I ever saw in my whole life came. And I couldn't do that. So I left and went on back to the college, and then during that moment, some of the industrious boys would get a job in the government where you could work at night. And you'd have much more money to pay your bills. But I realized I couldn't do that. Because I couldn't stay up all night. And so I came back home to my room, and I wrote the dean a letter. I guess if somebody come in at that time, I guess they would have thought I was crazy, because I had written a letter to Dr. Mays. I'd written a letter to my grandmother, and I'd packed my bag, and I could get everything in the bag except the letter to Dr. Mays and my grandma. But I couldn't get the damn bag closed. If somebody's been on the outside, they'd say, this crazy boy is in here. The next day, I didn't mail that letter. Next day I thought I'd give it a shot. I walked to a place called Portia's Restaurant on K Street. And I got a job waiting tables 1 meal a day. At that, I was on my way out of there. On that 1 meal a day, I don't know what I got, maybe $2. And I was a good waiter, I got tips. That got me back in school. I was 2 hours from leaving Howard University. Now, that was a kind of miracle in my life. And I stayed at Howard long enough to get a master's degree. And then I met my wife. I wrote to Mary Grace. You know, of course, that Mary Grace died about 3 months ago. And I've always been a book hound. I was not necessarily the best student in life, but I was, you come close to finding a fellow who read more than I did. And I made it easy in that way. And I stayed at Howard 3 years. And I had met Mary Grace my senior year at Talladega College. And I didn't see her anymore for the next 3 years. But for 3 years, before that, I met a young man who became a good friend of mine. I had gone to a conference, a religious conference at Talladega College, and I met Mary Grace. some of my life sounds like lies. But when I met Mary Grace, it was like an unbelievable novel. And I met a friend who lived down the hall from me, who was a fraternity brother, and I was looking through his book where he had gone to the same conference that I went to the following year. And I started flipping pages, and there was Mary Grace's picture. I said, where'd you meet this girl? He had gone to the conference the year before me. Mm. And so he said, that's the girl I'm going to try to marry. So I went to my room. I guess the most foolish thing I ever did in my life. I wrote her a letter, because I sent her a card after we met. And we exchanged cards 3 or 4 times. His name was Noah Harris. So I came to my room and I wrote Mary Grace a letter. I didn't propose as such. But I said, in effect, that we should get to know each other, because something happened at my meeting, and I'd just like to write to you to see if there's anything if there's any profound thing that matches the way I feel. I said, I'd just like to get acquainted, because I think you're the kind of girl I'd like to marry. That was the first letter. And I ran down to the mailbox and I put it in. I said, oh Lord, what a damn fool I am. I got up the next morning at 6 o'clock and I met the mailman and tried to get him to give me my letter back. He said, young man, he said, they sent me to prison for that.
Yeah, right.
I said, well, nobody here but you and me. I had my identity, I had all of it. And he wouldn't give it back to me. Now that started a correspondence. I didn't see Mary Grace for 3 years. But almost every other day, I'd read until 2 o'clock in the morning, and I'd write to Mary Grace. I did that so that when we finally got together, there was a stack of letters like that. But I was right. I was right. I hadn't seen her in 3 years. And when I took my degree, I saved enough money working at a hotel to take me to Chicago, where she was visiting her sister. We married the next year with no money. And I lost my first job as a director of Christian education at the AME Church. And the pastor liked me very much, but the first time I preached there, he would wait until, say, 10 minutes before the sermon was to be preached that first time. And he walked over to my seat. He said, "Jeff, you're preaching this morning." I didn't know anything about it. But every Sunday after that, I would get ready to preach. And about 2 Sundays after that, he called on me that way, but I had been preparing. And in churches, in Methodist churches, do that. They have you make the call to join the church. And the Lord blessed me that day, and the second time I preached. It sounds like a lie, but almost 20 people joined the church that Sunday.
Wow.
And I had promised to raise $1,500 for a building that they were going to build. And the pastor didn't like that, although he was a nice man. And I got very popular. And so I contacted the dean of the School of Religion, and I had the money in my hand. And he nixed it. And I told him where to go, and I left. We'd been married about 3 months. And I didn't have a job, so I pressed clothes for a week. And then the pastor sent me to New Haven to a small church. And during that, in that brief moment, my wife was pregnant. So I was at a new school, no money, and my wife pregnant. And this last thing I'll be through. I didn't have enough time to try to get a scholarship there because I spent, when my wife was pregnant, I got in Yale. And I'd finished that year. But then the bishop in the Methodist church, you have to do things that they want you to do. And the fact that I got into, for my second degree, I didn't have time to try to raise enough money for the second year, and I had Mary Grace take the exam, and she passed. And I couldn't get the money. So the last day, I went to see the YMCA head. And the secretary didn't want me to talk to him. And I wouldn't need. And she said, "Well, you have to come tomorrow, young man." He said, he goes home at 5 o'clock. It's 5 minutes after 5. And I stood there. And she said, "Young man," said, "Did you hear me?" I said, I have to see him today. She said, "I just told you, you come back tomorrow." This is actually the truth. So I stood there, and she said, "Did you hear me?" And I stood there. And she put her hand on the door, and she started to close it. She looked again. I hadn't moved. And so finally she went, she says, there's a young man out here, I told him to come tomorrow. She said, "I don't want to shut the door in his face, but He just stands there. So he looked at her. So wait a minute. I think we had about $50 that we had moved out of the manse. Mary Grace there with Anita at home. And I walked in. I said, Father, I have something to say. Now, you're not going to believe this. He looked at me. I was standing. He walked over to his table there. He had about 4 chairs around it. And he had you ever see a little bowl that people keep pipes in? He had about five pipes.
Oh, yeah, back in the old day. Yeah.
So he reached over and he picked up a pipe. I didn't sit down. I'm standing up. He got the pipe. He sat down. He got his lighter. He took the lighter on. He lighted his pipe. I'm standing there watching him. And he sat down. He lit his pipe. I said, Father, that's what they call the Episcopal priest. I said, I have a statement, and I want you to listen. Now, I don't know what I said, but I told him the story. And then I had to register tomorrow. My wife is in these, there are 3 basic types of universities in the country. Southern area, the middle area, and then the big groups, Yale and Harvard and whatnot. Mary Grace finished. She was a valedictorian of high school. She was number 3 in college. And we passed all these tests. And I didn't have any money but the $50. So I said, no. I gave him the background, and then I had a master's degree. And my wife was an honor student. She passed at the top of the list for Yale. And Yale and Harvard thought they were the greatest things in the world over there.
Right.
I said, now, I want you to listen to what I have to say. And I talked to him for 15 minutes, and I told him the story. I said, now, this is my last shot. And I told him about the bishop moving us. I had done a good job because I'm a good pastor. I knew how to do my thing. And I said, now, I realize how this sounds to you. I said, I've got to have enough money for 2 people for a year at Yale University. And I have to register tomorrow. So there's no way in hell for me to find this money. I said, this is our big shot. You see the credentials. I need enough money for 2 people for a year and a baby to care for. I said, as odd as it sounds, I'm asking you to make it possible for me to get. I think I needed, in those days, $2,000 was a whole lot of money. I had a scholarship, you see, and she was in graduate. She was going to graduate school. She had. So he looked at me. You aren't supposed to believe that. He looked at me. He said, in effect, he said, can you be here at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning? I said, yes, sir. I was there at 11 o'clock. You know what we did? We walked 3 blocks to the bank. And halfway to the bank, you know, he said, what did you say your name is? He said, my wife doesn't think I'm so bright anyway. We walk in the bank. He called for the owner of the bank. I wrote my name down in his book. The man handed me a check for $2,000. You believe that? At the end of that year, my wife and I were in the graduating line at the graduate school, the School of Religion. I wrote a paper. You know who Ryan O'Neill is?
Mm-hmm.
I wrote my paper for the year on the life and ministry of Ryan O'Neill. Mm. 5 other professors read the paper. I didn't know that, but one man read it. It was on basis of my judgment of the paper, because they were stunned that I was going to try to write on Ryan O'Neill. Ryan O'Neill's brother Richard Niebuhr was my professor. And the Evangelical Reformed Church is the denomination for Ryan O'Neill and his brother. And they all read my paper. At the end of that year, I got the job as race relations secretary for the Evangelical Reformed Church. It's as significant a job as I've ever had, maybe excepting the work that I did here. And it's because of that unbelievable story. It started with, again, Dr. Benjamin Wade. And that is the story of my life. So when they said it doesn't happen, it does happen. And it was because of that better than 6 odd years has passed between my wife and me, and what we've done, so that it was not just Howard Thurman. It was people like that that is the driving force behind our whole lives. And it's been the pinch button. Because I've lived too long. I'm 95 now, you know. But that is that's the basic story behind all of the things that you might be asking questions about. And that, whatever else I might say is.
Well, what I would, if this sounds okay with you, Reverend Rogers, what I'd like to propose is, if I can get the consent of our videographer, if we could come out one more time to talk with you maybe next week or the following week about your work as a race relations secretary. We're kind of at the end of our tape right now, but if we could come out maybe later in the month.
Well, I'll be here. You could. I need to talk to you anyway.
Okay.
About.
So we could stop the interview now.